Excellent. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Megan McLaughlin, one of the meeting managers, along with my partner today, Karen Keys-Gamara. So we'll be leading the session. Board members, if you wish to be called upon during the Q&A, please, as in the morning, just move your placard up and we'll take note of it. And I want to first begin by welcoming our guests who are here from MGT as consultants to present the Boundary Study Report. Karen and I were very fortunate as the meeting managers to spend time in reviewing their presentation, and we really appreciated how collaborative they were in taking our feedback and hopefully bringing the most salient points from their written narrative report to the presentation to you today. But again, bear in mind, with the time we have, there's no way that this PowerPoint is going to capture the depth of information that is in the report. So I encourage all of you and the public to please make sure you refer to the report and not use the PowerPoint as simply the guidepost of where we are. I just also wanted to lay the groundwork that it was the prior board that was mindful that our boundary policy had not been reviewed in a very long time. And so we thought that before we revise the boundary policy, which helps then guide staff work on boundaries and how we use them in Fairfax County Schools, that we wanted to have a consultant really help us ensure what are the best practices, what does the research tell us in the use of boundaries. And so that will be a key portion of what they're going to help share with us and the public today. So without further ado, Mr. Plattenberg, our Assistant Superintendent, I will turn it over to you and your team to begin the formal part of the presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. McLaughlin and Ms. Keys-Gamara, the meeting managers for today's meeting. We're certainly happy to be here to talk again about the boundary policy process. As you recall, and as Ms. McLaughlin just mentioned, in 2018, the school board began discussions regarding our boundary policy. In fact, we had 4 work sessions, staff work sessions, presented on the subject in October 15th of 2018 and February 25th of 2019, March 11th of 2019, and July 22nd of 2019. During the review of the boundary policy at that time, we provided information related to what other similar-sized school jurisdictions were doing, and it was a myriad. There were similar tenets that you'll hear about from the consultant, but we presented that information, and as Ms. McLaughlin had mentioned, the current boundary policy, really a comprehensive review hadn't been done since 1986 on that boundary policy. However, in 2000, there was an adjustment to it for allowing the superintendent to make boundary changes impacting 5% or less. But in 2018, the superintendent stopped that less than 2% approach. And so in the July 22nd, 2019 work session, the school board asked the superintendent to hire an outside consultant to work with the board to identify best practices in boundary policy and engage the community in that discussion. And so we're happy to have with us here Michael Reiser, who is the Senior Vice President of Educational Solutions, a group of MGT Consulting. MGT is a national consulting firm that is specialized in helping public education clients in planning for their long-range needs. MGT has worked with clients in the Washington metropolitan region as well as school districts across the country. They've prepared a presentation today and they're going to walk us through the review and the survey that they have conducted for our discussion this afternoon. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Reiser. Michael?
Thank you very much. As was said, MGT does do work on a national scale. We have done work in the Washington, D.C. metro area, in Northern Virginia, Southern Maryland, and all over the nation. We've been in the education consulting business almost 50 years, and our flagship products, if you will, are facilities master planning, facilities optimization, school enrollment boundary studies, and many times those all go by different names, but it's a lot of the same work being done inside of those projects. So that, and then just on a personal, professional level, I've been a part of at least 3 boundary studies and policy changes from my time working in school districts, in addition to the work we do at MGT. So if we can move on to the next slide. And I'm not used to presenting sitting down also, so if you see me fidgeting or moving, that's the teacher in me wanting to get up and present. We'll go over today the project timeline, which you will begin to see has been extended due to the pandemic, like a lot of things. This typically wouldn't be a 2-year project that would be taking the goals of the project, and we want to make sure we're really clear on what we were trying to accomplish, the best practices around school boundary policy, then the feedback from the community, and then really what you ask us to do, recommendations that we have for Fairfax County Public Schools as you move to consider future boundary policy. Next slide, please. So, as was mentioned, this work began in 2018 with the district, and then 2019 there was another presentation. Something I would highly recommend if you haven't is looking over the studies and the presentations that the administration made in 2018 and 2019. Very comprehensive, very well done work that is a lot more Fairfax centric, which will be important to the members of the board as you consider this work. But we were the fortunate winners in December of 2020, right into December 2019 and January of 2020 being awarded the work to do this study. We started the work, and then I visited Fairfax County in February of 2020. Then we all know about March of 2020 and what's happened over the past year. So the work that we have done really has never stopped, but had to be paused as we approached it. And you can see we did our analysis the spring of 2020 and then worked through 2020 to get the community survey and engagement work together. And then finally in September of 2021, we were able to do the community engagement sessions and unveil the survey and get the results of that. Next, please. So 3 things this project was looking at on our end. And one of them is not move boundary lines. That's one of those things that we've said in every engagement we've been part of, is we're going to make recommendations, but we're not making specific recommendations to school division boundaries or to school individual boundaries at this point. This is a study of best practice. This is a study of your community's feelings around best practice, and then recommendations that we have for the school division based upon best practice and community engagement. Any questions so far?
So we're going to let you finish your presentation, and then we will allow board members, they'll get on a list and we'll call on folks.
Excellent, excellent.
But thank you. So please go on.
All right. Next, please. So when we think about boundary policy, there are 3 overwhelming priorities. One being equity, and equity can be defined in a lot of different ways, but as we define equity, as we look at boundary policy, we're talking about that all students in a school district, in a school division, have equal access to high-quality schools and high-quality programs. That's equity that we're talking about in boundary studies. Then, secondly, we're looking at stability. This can be very contentious work. So when we talk about stability, we know that, and you'll see later, people buy their homes based upon what school they think their children are going to. People make decisions around that. So there's stability that is important when it comes to this. Also stability for children. For children not being moved midway through elementary school or midway through middle school. Stability is important around that. And then finally, efficacy. And we use the word efficacy because it's not just effectiveness, it's not just efficiency. You're not making policy just because it saves the most money. You're doing things that make common sense that are also highly impactful for students and families. So as we look at boundary policy, equity, stability, and efficacy should be the three most important things as we work through this. Then there's a difference between the words simple and the words easy. Boundary policy is pretty simple. Not easy, but it is not a complex, complicated thing. What has to be done as part of boundary policy, though, is prioritization. Because if everything is important, nothing is, and your policy then is not driven in any certain direction, and there can be arguments made. So this can be done of various ways. Some school districts say these are the most important factors in this descending order. Others actually put a percentage to it and say this has 50% impact, 25% impact, 10% impact, 5% impact on policy. But bottom line, there must be prioritization of the factors that drive boundary policy, including the three most important factors I just spoke of. So is equity most important? Is stability most important? Is efficacy most important? And then finding a way, hopefully, that those three can marry together in a priority order. Oh, stay there, please. Then I think something that everyone would agree with, where boundary policy goes off the rails in many cases, is when it is not implemented with fidelity or there is not an understanding of what the policy means. So when we talk about the implementation, three things really come to mind: transparency, clarity, and consistency. Transparency means that the community is aware, the schools are aware of what you're doing and how you're doing it. Clarity means that the policy and its associated procedures are extremely clear about how they will be executed and implemented. And then finally, consistency means that the policy is carried out in the way that the policy was designed, and that there are not myriad exceptions to the rule and then very few rules. Next, please. So next we're going to shift into a few things, and this is a little bit of a primer, and I apologize if some of this seems very common sense, but in many ways it really is. These are the things that should drive boundary policy or should be addressed as part of boundary policy. So there are several factors around enrollment. You can have a growing enrollment across the district. You can have a decreasing enrollment across the district. But many times what you see looking to drive boundary policy is there is uneven enrollment across the district, where some schools are at or over capacity and others are woefully under capacity. And there, many times a goal of boundary policy is balancing capacity and enrollment across a district or a division. Next, please. Facilities drive boundary policy. An aging building may no longer be able to hold the same number of students it did. It may not be as technologically advanced, and therefore programs cannot be located there. Then also new facilities can drive boundary policy simply because if a new building is built within current existing boundary lines, there need to be new boundaries drawn as well. Next slide, please. So financial considerations also need to be made as part of boundary policy, and thoughtfulness, basically meaning it does no longer make sense to keep a building open from the financial cost of keeping that school open. It can also be a regulatory change where, for example, some states regulate what floors kindergarten, first and second grade can be on, what type of rooms early childhood classrooms can be in, and because of some state regulatory change, you may no longer have buildings that can accommodate the type of programs you want to have there, and then there must be lines drawn around that. And then transportation should be taken into consideration as well. Approximately anywhere from $60,000 to $70,000 a year per bus, if you break that out by that, if you think about transportation cost. And that's pretty much a national average. So that also may not be the thing that is driving your boundary policy, but definitely needs to be a consideration, is what the cost of the current boundary policy. Next, please. A goal of boundary policy many times can be feeder pattern alignment, and we often refer to this as nesting dolls, meaning you know when you choose an elementary school, what middle school and what high school you have the opportunity to matriculate through. And many times a nesting doll scenario can also be called a pyramid, and I think that's a term that's very familiar in Fairfax, or at least is used as part of the common vernacular, meaning, and a very simplistic example, there are 4 elementary schools that feed into 2 middle schools that feed into 1 high school in a pyramid setting. And then programming change also sometimes can drive boundary policy, meaning a district decides to go from K-5 to K-6, or from K-5 to K-8, or early childhood now becomes a part of school buildings and capacity changes around buildings, so that also drives that. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I very much do not like to do is read PowerPoint slides to you, so I'm going to give you a second to read PowerPoint slides to yourself, and then we'll briefly go over this. This is the current FCPS policy. And as we said, I believe it has been since 1986. Is that the? Yeah. And the one thing that I would point out is factors 1 through 6 have no prioritization. And that is the thing that is most apparent to me in the role that I play. If we were doing a project and where I was making definitive recommendations around your boundary policy, which I am in some ways, but if we were saying now we need to put this into practice, that would be definitely the thing that pops out the most to me. Are we okay to move on? Yeah. All right. Then also, your policy also outlines the 3 different type of adjustments that can be made to the current plans. So administration covers emergency, new housing, but less than 5% of the enrollment at each school could be affected. And expedited is less than 15%, and then a standard boundary adjustment would be 15% or more of the current student enrollment of a school being impacted. And then again, the considerations and factors that are not in priority order again, that all play into boundary policy. I wouldn't be terribly overwhelmed by the number of things that are up here. I think if we took some time and we worked through this, we could start combining under themes. And that's one of the things that we talk about. You know, I think you could put busing times and walking and busing safety together, and you start getting a theme, really the themes that we talked about earlier. The enrollment, the transportation, the programmatic, the stability, the equity, those type of things play in. Next, please. And finally, this is just how boundaries, or people are notified of boundary change and what phasing looks like. And really your phasing right now is a form of grandfathering, which is very common, probably the most common across the nation. Next, please. So, as we look at these, and you can see your policy, we're shifting gears here a little bit, as we can see your policy covered these things, but as you're making boundary policy, the first adjustment to consider is a standard adjustment, where this is when your lines are being moved and it's being done as part of a process that you're going to see from us. We recommend that every 5 years you evaluate the need for a standard boundary adjustment. Doesn't mean that every 5 years you're moving lines, but every 5 years you're looking at the trends that have happened the past 5 years, as well as the projections for the next 5 years of, do we think we need to make any adjustments of the policy or the practices? It would also be my point that good policy doesn't need to change. Policy informs practice and procedure. So when we talk about these type of things, really what we're talking about is not every 5 years your boundary policy changing. every 5 years, your boundary policy is informing the practice and the implementation into the actual procedures. So you have to have administrative, you don't have to, but it is best practice to have administrative adjustment as well, and that can be really two things. What are the exceptions to the rule? Meaning a parent drives past a school that is not their assigned school every day on the way to work, and it makes more sense for that parent to be able to drop their child off from a ease standpoint. You know, how are those exceptions made? And then what exemptions are made? Temporary is a real-time, non-permanent response to environmental factors. And a very pertinent example, something that just happened in the area of the world that I live in southern Indiana, not far from Mayfield, Kentucky, just right across the border. And there's people whose schools aren't there right now. A temporary and an immediate or an emergency are very similar, but you know that, hey, we're gonna need 6 months to get this school fixed. We're gonna draw lines just really, and at this point, these are very logistical because you know they're short term. We're gonna draw a line here, and kids are now gonna go to elementary school A for the remainder of the school year. Next fall, their school will open back up and that temporary adjustment goes away. Emergency are things that have to be made in real time, but may not be temporary. Meaning something that could happen around the Fairfax County community, a military base closes, a new industry moves to town. You know, like Amazon decides that their headquarters are now going to be in Tyson's Corner, and you have people immediately moving in, and you have to make a real-time adjustment that does not have that temporary binding to it. Next, please. So as you implement, and again, this isn't necessarily policy, this is when the policy gets into action. The policy needs to consider when will a new boundary take effect? And there's much discussion around that. Some believe, let's do it right now, let's rip the Band-Aid, this is how it's going to happen. Others, we're going to phase this in over time so students who now are in this school can remain, a grandfathering type of thing. New students who are starting school, it will impact them, and then you have anywhere from depending on the level of school, you have a 3 to 5 year implementation of policy. Now, something I do want to point out, it is best practice to evaluate boundary implementation every 5 years. If you're grandfathering, it's going to literally, at times, seem like there's always constant change. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I always like to point out sort of the consequences. A 5-year implementation of grandfathering means that the next time you evaluate, you might go right back into grandfathering again for a new group of students and families. And then, what are the exemptions that will be allowed? And we talked about the administrative adjustment. It is so important to clarify the exemptions and the exceptions to the rule and how they apply, whom they apply to, how long they will apply. And this is really an exercise of scenario building out where you want to leave no stone unturned, and you want to give your school administration an opportunity to work through things, because odds are they've seen them before when small adjustments were made, of what are those. So nothing ruins credibility more than exceptions to the rule that weren't supposed to be exceptions to the rule, and then it looks like they're not being implemented equitably or fairly across the district. Next slide, please. So as I've already said, I tend to, when I present, to get ahead of myself and give spoilers the entire time. But every year there should be annual monitoring, and that should be reported out to the board, whether it's in a session like this or just in documentation that you receive. Here's what the enrollment of the district looks like across schools, across segments of the district, just so you know, it's sort of in real time, so it's not a 5-year surprise of the direction that you're moving in. And then every 5 years, there should be a more formal approach where adjustments could, if necessary, be made. Again, not saying every 5 years you're going to be moving boundaries. It's just that's a good time frame to evaluate within. Next, please. Okay, so I want to manage expectations sort of right off the bat. We sent surveys to 125 families. The respondents were a little less than 10%, so we had 11,000 respondents back. Something I can tell you from experience is unless, and we were very clear, because we tried to keep your phone lines working, we were very clear that we were not adjusting boundaries as part of this. This was input, community feedback around boundary policy. And a 11,000 person response is pretty strong when you're not impacting boundaries. I can tell you though, in studies that we've done, when we are actually moving boundary lines and the community is giving feedback on scenarios, a 25% response rate would be very impressive. So what you'll find and you'll see in a lot of communities is unless people feel like they are being specifically impacted, it's kind of hard to get the input. But what I will tell you is what you're about to see is very representative of what we see across the nation when we are putting boundary practice in place and we are making recommendations around people's sentiments. Next, please. So something we were pleased with is our response rate across the race and ethnicity of the makeup of Fairfax County schools was pretty representative. Not exactly spot on, but pretty representative of the community as we did the survey. Next, please. You can see that about 14%, or actually just about 10% of the people identified of being of Hispanic, Latinx, or Spanish origin. And that's also fairly close, not spot on. Next, please. Something that we were very pleased with is this is our response by high school pyramid. And one of the concerns that we have when we do this is you see one pyramid looks like this. And you realize that you have overwhelming input from one segment of the community. You aren't seeing that here. You do see some pyramids with more responses than others, but every high school pyramid is represented and no pyramid has overwhelming responses compared to another. Next, please. And you can see our percentage response by region as well. Fairly balanced, not completely, but fairly balanced responses. Next, please. The median household income in Fairfax is $124,000, almost $125,000. You can see that we're fairly close on that as well. The respondents were a little more wealthy than the average or the median income in the community. Next, please. The languages spoken in the home were fairly representative as well, although Spanish speakers were a little underrepresented in this by their feedback. I do want to say that the survey was available in multiple myriad languages, so that was not a limiter on the survey. Next, please. So, into the responses. And like I said, the responses that we got are very similar to what we see nationwide. So, why did you buy the home that you bought? Top 3 responses were a specific school, to attend Fairfax County Public Schools, or because of the character of the neighborhood. So what an overwhelming majority has said is the neighborhood that we lived in is important to us, and that's why we bought our home. So we either go to this school, Fairfax County as a whole, or just that character of the neighborhood where they live. Next, please. How does your kid get to school? Again, this is fairly representative of the district as a whole. You have 65% of kids within the district who ride the bus at least once a day, and this could equal over 100% because sometimes families use different methods, but 58% of the respondents also were bus riders, so fairly spot on. Next, please. Question of how easy is it to get to school? Of the respondents, 75% are 15 minutes or less to get to school. Next question. So this question is asking how long should a kid spend on the bus, or how long should it take to get to school? 83% of the respondents felt like it should take a half hour or less to get to school. Next. 88% of respondents say their students either attend or are planning to attend their base school. Next, please. Of the 12%, so these responses here are only of the 12% who are not attending their base school. Of the 12% not attending their base school, over half of them are so their student can attend a specialized program. Next, please. So this question here is asking, what should we do if a school is over-enrolled? Meaning there's more students than the building has comfortable capacity for. Only 30% said you should adjust school boundaries. So that, not saying, and this was highest priority. So I don't want to say that there won't ever, but that was only 30% of the people said that was their highest priority. The sentiment was 40% thought that there should be an addition or additional facilities to support the school. In other words, if there's not enough capacity, increase the capacity was a sentiment, or increase capacity by adding temporary classrooms were high priorities. So 40% feel that you should add on, 30% believe that a boundary adjustment was the way to solve overcrowding. Next slide. So what if a school is under-enrolled? What should we do then? 31% believed that you should make the school more attractive through programmatic changes. So magnetize the school would be one way of putting that. And then 29%, which is fairly in line with the previous slide. If you increase the number of students assigned to that school, you're adjusting boundaries to do so. So that's a pretty consistent response for both of those questions of the people who their first instinct is adjusting boundary lines. Next, please. So I want to take a second to explain this slide. And the question is asked with us knowing best practice is 5 to, some districts put it after 10 years. We recommend 5. 21% say as necessary, meaning anytime a boundary needs to be adjusted, that's when it should be done. 4% say never. 7% said every 11 years or more. But then you have 21% saying 2 to 4 years. You have 27% saying 5 to 10 years. 7% with once a year, and then 12% did not answer. Really, the purpose of this question is for a board and a district to see the tolerance, because we asked in the previous questions what should be the highest priority. But I think what it does show is families do realize there may be times that boundaries need to be adjusted. What I can tell you from experience, though, too, is it's kind of, I don't know if you've ever heard the metaphor or the anecdote about your congressman in Congress. You know, the majority of people think Congress is corrupt, but their congressman isn't. but every person in America feels that way. So, yeah. So there are people here who are saying boundary moves are great as long as they happen to you. So I just want to point that out there, that this is giving you some level of tolerance. You know, you have, what I would tell you is you have 4% of your community that responded that has 0 level of tolerance for moving. But you have others who understand that it is probably a necessary component. Next, please. So the reason you're seeing multiple bars here is people were asked to rank order what should the considerations for boundary policy be. And this is where I do want to compliment your community, and I told you I couldn't stay down. So I'll kind of do this. I talked loud enough, probably, you know, Megan and Karen's mic's picking me up. But equity is just out there. Remember we talked in the very beginning, what should the 3 priorities of boundary policy be? Equity. Ensure specialized programs are located in all regions of the county. There's that one. Keep students together from elementary through high school. Stability. Reduce travel time. Efficacy. There, you know, your community is, which is probably the most heartening piece of data I can throw up here. Of the respondents, your community is embracing what the priorities of boundary policy are. In theory, yes, as long as it's, yeah. But I mean, I think what you should take from this, and no joking aside, if you're going to make boundary changes, what's the most important thing? Stability, efficiency, and effectiveness, which together make efficacy, and equity. So, you know, that is an important thing to see. Next, please. So, when a boundary changes occur, how should the change happen? I don't think this should come as any surprise. Stability and choice is, you know, so what we saw were students should be able to stay in the school that they're currently in, and new students to the school should be the impacted ones, whether they move in or matriculate through. The other thing that we saw as a pretty significant response was choice, where if a boundary line moves, I can choose to go to the new school. And one thing that we will see that is best practice is a little bit in the weeds, but I want to mention this now because I don't think it's mentioned anyplace else in the presentation. It's in the paper. When students choose a new school as part of boundary adjustment, sometimes districts will keep seats open in both buildings for kids and sort of underinflating the district's capacity, if you will. A best practice is once a family chooses, that becomes their new home school, and sort of the grandfathering goes away if they choose to now attend another school, especially from that choice standpoint. Next, please. So in addition to the survey, we also held 3 webinars where we talked to the community about best practice, very similar to the presentation that I gave you in the beginning. And overwhelmingly, these were FCPS parents who were part of this, and overwhelmingly people who had children in the system. And their sentiments and feelings were very much spot on with what the survey said as well. Next, please. And you can see that we had a fairly strong showing across age groups of kids. You know, obviously, and you'll see this a lot, elementary school parents can be the most impacted by a boundary shift because it's going to impact students for years into the future. But, you know, you have 1,500 or so families, but then well over 600 and 700 middle and high school families. That's a good breakout for those groups because many times engagement starts to fall off as children get older. Next, please. So, here we go. These are the recommendations we make around your boundary policy. I've got a list here, but then we're going to break into each of them separately so we can have a chance to see more over what they mean. So let's go right into the next one. We'll talk about the recommendations individually. So you've heard this before, sort of the overriding theme is recommendation number one is to prioritize with the focus on equity, stability, and efficacy. And each of these has a little bit of a call-out explanation. If all priorities are equal, nothing's a priority. And what I would tell you here is we were asked this question by the district. We were asked it in the meeting managers meeting that we had. A lot of M's there. This is a community by community decision. It is best practice to prioritize, but the way Montgomery County, Maryland prioritized their boundary study doesn't necessarily mean that's the way that the family of Fairfax feel that the priorities should be. It is a community by community decision to set your priorities. Next, please. Capacity is probably the most misunderstood thing outside of curriculum and instruction in the education world, because there is fire marshal capacity, there is building capacity, there is programmatic capacity. It is very important, and I think your division does a really good job of this, but I think we want to make sure as we're looking at this that there's a clear definition and articulation of what a capacity of a building is and what a programmatic capacity is for that. Next, please. I feel I would be remiss if we didn't make this recommendation that you need to work to balance enrollment and available seats in districts. And we see this across, there was a slide up there where we talked about increased enrollment, decreased enrollment, unbalanced enrollment. Something that we see across the nation in a lot of our larger urban or suburban districts is unbalanced enrollment, where some schools have very high capacity issues and they're over capacity. Other schools are frankly almost empty. And this would be a focus, whether it's done through programs, and I don't want to get ahead of myself again, but something that is important to keep in mind is there's only so much money to go around a school division. And if you're spending money on buses or keeping buildings open or fixed costs of facilities that could be spent on student success, a caring culture, or premier workforce, or resource stewardship, that's something that has to be taken into account. Not saying it's purely a financial decision, but it has to be on the table in certain situations. Next, please. So right along with that is work to centralize and regionalize programs with great demand. So one of the ways that you can increase enrollment in buildings, especially if they're buildings that are in good shape, that are easy to get to, if you will, that is to put more attractive programs in those schools. Next, please. Overwhelmingly, we kept seeing the community feels that students should not travel far to school. So limiting time on buses and creating efficient transportation networks as part of that. Next, please. We talked about this earlier as well, create an established and well-articulated exemption process. And it has to be done in an equitable way. And again, transparency, clarity, consistency when it comes to an exemption process. And finally, formally evaluate school boundaries every 5 years. And I'll point it out like I did the first few times I said it. This does not mean that boundaries must be adjusted every five years. But if slight adjustments are done on an established regular basis, they aren't such a big deal. They become sort of the way we do things because, I mean, obviously if you go trying to adjust boundaries after almost, 40 years, yeah, they're quite a bit different. All right, that concludes my presentation. Happy to answer any questions that any of you may have or elaborate on anything that needs more clarification.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate that with, 50 slides, that was a lot to cover. But I do hope that my colleagues found it helpful for really framing out the extensive report that I again emphasized we all want to make sure we dig into and read. So at this point, colleagues, we've done our best to capture who's signaled that they wish to speak. So in this order, and I'll keep updating it, we have Mr. Frisch, followed by Laura Jane Cohen, followed by Karen Corbett Sanders.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. I want to be clear that when we're talking about the community, when reviewing this data, we're talking about respondents and not a representative sampling of the community, correct?
Yes, absolutely. You know, the one thing I would say is your respondents responded in a way that we would expect given the work that we've done around this. But if there was an eighth recommendation, it would be extensive community feedback around this work when it happens, making sure that all populations of the division are heard from.
Have you conducted representative sampling in other school divisions around these subjects?
We have when it is more immediate. Typically, we're doing this around, like I said, where we're recommending the moving of lines. So that would, it is difficult, just in a lot of the things that we do around policy, it's difficult to get a lot of respondents.
Mm-hmm.
Which is one reason why I ask about representative samples, because it's easy to project our own feelings onto analysis that only includes people who were moved to respond. Kind of an out there question, if we were to implement this as recommended, have you seen novel techniques for implementing a policy and moving forward? One thing that I've thought about and talked with other colleagues about is the BRAC system we use for our military bases, the base realignment and closure commissions, where the politicians are taken out of the process, at least initially, and the community and stakeholders and local experts are brought into the process, at least initially, so that they have buy-in in the process. Have you seen anything like that for these purposes?
I've absolutely seen that. Some school districts will spend years, literally leading up. You know, so and there's a district that I'm very familiar with that is coming up on the time that they're reevaluating their boundaries. They've had a cross-functional community committee made up of community members, school principals, parents, and other central office people who deal with this every day, educating the committee on the impacts, the unintended consequences, what past moves have looked like. So yeah, there's definitely a body of work around that type of community involvement.
I ask because some of the questions, you know, having people around the room discussing the problems and hearing what the pushback on some of the solutions would be, might change some of the answers that we're seeing. When we ask a community, would you rather have your students stay for their entirety of their education and only have the new people move on, we're not telling them how difficult that would be when we are changing a boundary.
Yes, and that's where one of the things, if this was an actual boundary study, we're doing one for a district right now. We're building out multiple scenarios, and I think that's something else that's super important when you show different scenarios, because each of those scenarios has a price tag also, and that's where you really start to look at what that cost-benefit analysis is, or the opportunity cost of one decision versus another.
What's the best practice for phasing? You know, one thing that occurs to me is an equity concern if it's done differently from school to school.
Grandfathering tends to be the best practice.
But that's a loaded answer, right? Like, what type of grandfathering?
So grandfathering means if you started in the school, you finish in the school. It is a district by district. Again, part of the scenario. If you started building out scenarios like this, you would start asking your community if you could questions. if you could stay, would you? If you're, what do you wish that would be the best case scenario for your students? Do you have students potential students who haven't started school yet? I'm trying to think, preschool age kids. What do you hope would happen with them? And finding what the community sentiment from that is, and then from those you have actual numbers that you can build scenarios out on, and from those scenarios, then you see what the cost of grandfathering it is, but because grandfathering can look different. But typically the way grandfathering looks is all the students currently in the school can stay through their matriculation. The spin up in cost of that is you're basically for a period of 4 to 5 years running 2 different transportation systems.
That's easy. And I guess you don't need double the drivers, right? All right. On slides 21 and 22, it appears that Hispanics were left out of the first round of questioning about ethnicity, race, and had their own separate question.
That was how we were asked to ask that question in the survey.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's interesting. And then to that end, I'm looking at the pinwheel of pyramids. It does look to be fairly representative, but if you group the schools by relative neighborhood, it might be a little imbalanced with certain areas overrepresented compared to others. Pause the clock really quick.
It's one of the reasons we broke out by region as well, so you could see some of that. And again, it's not perfectly balanced. This is given the scope of the work and the scope of the project we were doing, I feel like it was a robust enough survey to give you sort of the ideas. But again, when this becomes where the rubber hits the road, there has to be a lot more in-depth, intentional targeting stakeholder involvement, if you will.
And then finally, slide 29, and maybe this is a question for Mr. Plattenberg. We have the actual information about how long it takes students generally, at least for the buses, to get to school, don't we? How does that compare to the data of people's self-responses?
We do pretty well, and we were kind of pleased with it. In fact, we had discussed it. However, we do have those outliers, which you're very well aware of. They exceed quite extensively that 30-minute. A lot of our special programs.
One of the things that we see in our work across the nation is typically in districts like Fairfax, students with the longest bus drives have families that have chosen for them to be on the bus for a particular program. I'm not saying that's always the case. Yeah, so it would be using your terminology, a non-based school to attend an IB program, let's say, that is a little further away. So that is it's when it's not a choice, it's when it's one of those things that need to be given further scrutiny.
All right, well, I'm out of time. I really appreciate everything that you've said today.
Mr.
Thank you.
Frisch, would you like to have a go back?
Please.
Okay. So I've got at least 7 board members, so I want to make sure if your placard's up, we have captured it. I've got Laura Jane, followed by Karen Corbett-Sanders, Ricardi Anderson, Bro Mish, Elaine Tolan, Rochester Seismerheiser, Melanie Marin.
Thank you, and I appreciate. I'll kind of continue with Carl's line of questioning. I think that's one of the things that gives me pause here, and not your fault. I watched in every way of you trying to garner community engagement to get survey feedback, and I felt like I participated in the community meetings. The board was able to take the survey to. I mean, I think I answered it in 3 different ways: as a parent, as a board member, as a community member. So I really appreciate the outreach to everybody. It's disappointing. I mean, this is not limited to you in any way, shape, or form, but we see the same problem no matter how we try to crack the egg. The same families that we don't hear from, If it's us, if it's you, if it's, and it's disappointing because certainly I think even just what Carl said about the vast majority of respondents here are people whose kids commute 15 minutes or less. your idea of the implication of where your kid goes to school is going to look very different. If my kid, because they access special education, is on a bus for an hour and a half to get to Key Center. And so I struggle with, we as a board are still really working to try to figure out ways of how do we hear from those people? How do we hear from people who aren't making over $150,000 a year? How do we hear from people who have limited English proficiency? I know that's not unique to us, but so I think you've made the very most of what you could with what you got, and I'm very appreciative of that. I just, wanted to say that I think maybe if we can combine some of what we're learning with this from the SPED audit as well, AAP report, right? This all sort of feeds in what we just were talking about with John Lewis and academies and different programming. It's all part and parcel. So I think Jeff and I have this conversation 157 times every other month of it's not just one thing. It's not just the boundaries. It is part and parcel where we put programs, where we, what are the real boundaries? They look very different because kids do access all kinds of different things. So making sure that we can figure out some way to cohesively talk about what we're really looking at, I'm not sure yet how we figure that out. I think this is the first step in that.
So I think you said something terribly insightful. The factors facing school districts are systemic, and they can't necessarily be, you have to, anybody who studies problem solving know that you solve the problem in front of you, then the next problem, and you do it by chunk. But it's doing it as a systemic solution and thinking about things systemically. How does the decision we make in transportation impact academics? How does the decision we make in academics impact transportation? From a community involvement standpoint, it's something we struggle with. It's something we see the districts we work with struggling with a lot. And you have to be careful with this. So I caution as I recommend it, it's that targeted community and, talking to your principals and saying, we have underrepresentation in some surveys in these areas. Do you have families that you think, now, what I'm going to say is those will be the most engaged families of a unengaged population. So, like I said, it's not scientific, but at least there's that one further step that's there. The other thing that I did say in the meeting managers meeting also is best practice regardless of a community's opinion of best practice. And what we did see from the respondents is there was, I almost got an amen, I thought there. It was, oh yeah. So it was a little heartening to see the way that one question was framed as we were going through looking for what are the themes from the responses. Oh, they're saying if you do it with these areas which are part of best practice. Very rarely do you have anyone in the community raising their hand saying, move me, though.
And I would say the 11 emails I've gotten from people from Daventry in the last 24 minutes that you've been talking, definitely. But I appreciated what you said about consistency and being consistent, though that has been frustrating, I know, for this board and Dr. Brabrand on numerous occasions when hearing from certain communities. When we don't get it right, it just continues. And now even conversations that we have about Lewis Academy, about the magisterial districts, all lead into this fear that something that is inequitable is gonna happen again. So I appreciate it. I know I'd love to be on a go back if we have time, but thanks for your advice.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move over to Ms. Corbett Sanders, and for the audience listening, I do want to just put an emphasis that I do believe our board deeply appreciates the 11,600 families who did engage in this. And to Laura Jane's point, our system did a lot along with the consultants. We will always strive to get more people engaged, but it was a little palpable to me. I don't want our community to take it the wrong way. We value their input.
Thank you, and thank you, Ms. McLaughlin. I don't think anybody disregards or doesn't value the input of constituents across this county. I think that we all want to hear from constituents across the county, and that's the key. It's a county-wide approach. It cannot be individual communities. And so that's where I do worry that on page 24, when you talk about the regions, the least representative regions as far as input are regions 2 and 3, and region 3 is actually the largest region in all of Fairfax County. So when you have only 14% of the largest region, and actually the least amount of people from that region across the board, it is something that we need to do more to get them to get more representation. I do support your concepts, your recommendations. I do want to bring the attention of this board to one key piece, which is the transportation piece. And my data is old, but in 2019, 110,000 students across Fairfax County were on buses. Of that 110,000, 24% spent more than a half an hour each way on the bus. And of that, 42% of the elementary school students in Region 4 spent more than a half an hour each way on the bus, with 19% at the high school level. And in Region 3, 32% of the middle school students spent more than a half an hour on the bus and 15% at the high school level. So those are real numbers, and those are the numbers that aren't represented when we look at who participated in the survey. So we do need to do more to find ways of encouraging and getting people to provide those responses. I would love, as a next step, to have updates of those numbers, of what percentage, but I do know that I have elementary school students who pass two elementary schools to get to the school that they go to. And that is when people question the efficacy of what we're doing. I would like a commitment that when we talk community by community, we mean district by district approaches. And I would also like to better understand the pupil placement impact, because I do know one of my high schools is now under capacity, but it's because we changed our pupil placement policy. And we had a significant percentage of that school then get pupil placed to another school. So you haven't talked about pupil placement policy, but I'd like to get some feedback from you on your views on that. And that was at a high school level. And what do you think of having a school that doesn't have a single person being able to walk to it? Thank you.
So two things. I think we go back to the systemic approach. You know, boundary policy and pupil placement go hand in hand. A school that not a single kid can walk to. So in Louisville, Kentucky, where I spent a significant amount of my time as a central office administrator, Louisville Male High School is the second largest school in Jefferson County. Not one kid can walk to it, but it is the district's traditional high school uniforms and the oldest high school that was moved to a central location. So I don't think there's anything, and again, that's from a personal thing. From a professional standpoint, as a consultant, we recommend magnet schools many times that are not within a community. From a professional standpoint, as far as community building, base schools are not ideal if they do not have a neighborhood around them.
Can I be clear? The school in Kentucky was a magnet school that you just described?
Yes.
No, I'm talking about a base school
Yeah.
where everybody would be bused to.
Like I said, that isn't ideal. But if we look at looking systemically, and you have buildings that could be enrolled at capacity if students were allowed to go there because of programmatic setups, that is definitely something that is best practice in that case. Base schools not having neighborhoods, not.
Great, thank you very much. Ms. Corbett-Sanders, just for clarity, how many schools in your region are not neighborhood and everyone's bused in? Is it just the one middle school?
We have a middle school, and then we have a whole neighborhood that passes 2 elementary schools to get to the 3rd elementary school.
Okay. I mean, I know one of the things we have to sort
And
out
then
is
we
with.
have- Actually, I have 2 elementary schools where whole neighborhoods
Yeah.
are bussed in from over half an hour.
Yeah. I mean, with 200 schools, we have outliers, and that's part of your presentation is getting better fidelity. So thank you. Did you want to go back? Okay, think about it. All right, I have Dr. Anderson, followed by Abrar Ramesh, and then Elaine Tolan.
All right, thank you. Not to belabor the point, but if we could go back to that slide, I'd like for that to go up. I serve Region 2, which did slightly better in terms of representation in this process than Region 3. But I also want to offer the schools that I represent in that region. When you look at this other one that has the colored chart, this is page 23, if you could go back. Region 2 serves McLean and Langley, which are 572, 751 responses, and also Annandale, Falls Church, and Justice. And you see those responses are quite low, 179, 303, 170. So having that disaggregated data, even beyond the region, it's also important because we don't have the representation. And I don't want to belabor what everybody here has already said. It's a problem, and it's one that we do have to address in many ways. I'm going to jump into some of my questions. Slide 41, where you highlight, no, not slide 41, the one that has our priorities. For Christ's sakes, I had it open here. I really did. I don't know. They're the 6 priorities that are listed. I know this is not necessarily in the scope of your employ in this work, but I would love to hear your thoughts or what other places have done in terms of prioritizing, not the recommendations, the factors. It's early on. Thank you. Okay. Whatever. There's 6 of them. I would love to hear your thoughts in terms of what should we be looking at and thinking about when prioritizing those 6 factors. What are other jurisdictions doing? Even though I lost so much time. Even though I know you said, they're all different, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
I'm going to couch my statement in my original one that it is a community by community decision. There is, and it really depends on what the situation, and I'm not avoiding your question. It depends on the situation the district is in. A district in financial trouble is going to prioritize crowding and balancing and making best use of existing space. A district focused on equity is going to make sure that there's equitable access for all students across the district for high-quality programs. Districts based upon stability are, with finances, are going to find a way to try to build themselves out of a problem. And we see that across the nation. I wish that there was a magic, solution for this, but in most cases, that's what you see. I think what I could say the best practice around these is a district needs to embrace its reality. So embrace its finances, embrace what the capacity looks like across the district as a whole, by region, by pyramid, and then I'm not trying to overcomplicate. In some cases, you're prioritizing within areas of the district in potentially different ways.
Okay, I appreciate that. You've had a chance to kind of learn a little bit about our district, I would imagine.
Yes.
You've had a chance to learn what our community wants, and I'm pushing you a little bit.
Okay.
So bear with me. What do you assess is our priority?
I think you should begin with equity and have and again, I'm going to start with that. You should begin with equity and have a very clear definition of what equity means to the district. Then you should assess the district's opportunity cost for overcrowding of buildings and under-enrollment of buildings. portable classrooms are very expensive. Renovations are very expensive. Keeping buildings open that are under-enrolled is probably the most expensive of those things. My data's a couple years old on this because the work we did has sort of taken a pause over this period of time. But it's about $2 million on average just to keep a building open every year outside of teaching staff. That's utilities and upkeep and maintenance and, so $2 million every year over and over. So if it were me and I was looking at it, that is what I would prioritize. And I would prioritize it from those themes that we recommended right off the very bat.
Okay, that's the equity, stability, efficacy. Mr. Plattenberg, how many of our schools are under-enrolled? I'm just imagining you have this at the ready.
We have our CIP presentation coming up this Thursday.
So no answer for me?
No answer at this time.
Wow.
I don't know it off the top of my head.
Okay. All right, Jeff. I'm going to let it go. My next question.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
We're 10,000 below, so predominantly every school has had a contraction. We're still at the tail end. I'd like to say the tail end of this pandemic because we've seen a little bit of an increase, but I really don't have that because there's been such a broad shift.
Okay. I'll wait and come back to that when we can. The other-
Chairman Anderson, or Dr. Anderson, may I just clarify, what you asking, what school has over 100% capacity? What's at 100? What's at 90% of enrollment to capacity? Is that what you're asking?
I get, not necessarily the capacity, but schools that we consider to be under-enrolled. Under-enrolled, which means those buildings year in, year out.
Right.
That we are having trouble retaining
And
kids.
we do have a few, but that gets back to the presentation that talked about fire code capacity, building capacity, and program capacity. But to your point, we have had a few that were, in fact, other board members have worked with us on some schools that had been continuously under-enrolled.
Well, I would like to put a pin for when we have the CIP conversation. Before my time expires, you talked about the 5-year review and making sure that we're looking at this yearly, the 5-year review. I find, and maybe this is what it is everywhere, that the process here in Fairfax County is largely dependent on the school board members kind of moving the boundary discussion. Ms. Tolan and I, we've just done this year, so I'm speaking from a place of authority here. Who should be initiating that? In your expert opinion, and what happens in other places?
It should be initiated by the board and then implemented by the administration because one thing that we all know is this is, I will use that simple doesn't mean easy. This is simple and very exhausting work at the same time. And it is not something that, again, that's the reason you don't do it every year, but it should be set by the board in policy that every 5 years, every 10 years, whatever, like I said, best practice is about 5. And then there are district procedures in place. So similar as I answered the gentleman's question, typically a district will start their process 2 years in advance just of educating the community of here's the direction we're moving in for that. But that gets, the board makes the policy with the parameters within it. The district administration is then charged with making the procedures that implement the policy.
May I clarify my question? I know my time is up, but that's not what I
Oh, I'm sorry.
was looking to ask.
You may clarify your question.
Thank you. I definitely am clear that the board should set the policy and staff makes it happen. I guess when we get down to the nitty-gritty, and I'm just speaking very closely from a space that I was just a few months ago, where we had a school that was highly overcrowded. I felt like the impetus was on me as a school board member to bring that forward to the board for its consideration. We had the concurrence in this very room, and then staff took off from there. Is there space for staff to evaluate across the years that they are evaluating, plus at the 5-year mark where it's something more formal is being recommended, that they bring the list to the board for its consideration, rather than what I perceive to be the other way around?
Yeah, I think that definitely is a possibility. I think that is that could even be part of policy that, there are districts we work with because, and I'm not saying this is the Fairfax standard by any means, but a building is considered under capacity if it's less than 75% of its capacity, and it's considered to be critically under capacity if it's under 50%. And as Mr. Plattenberg just said, there's different factors around that. It's really the programmatic capacity is what we're talking about at that point. But the same can be said for the upside of, you know, a building is considered to be within capacity anywhere from 75% to 115% of programmatic capacity. So you can extend above an actual number of capacity up to 115% and still be within a industry standard. But there should be, I guess to your question, there should be some red flag or some type of impetus that, hey, we've hit this number, now we need to start X process.
No, thank you for that. Thank you.
Did you want to go back, Dr. Anderson?
I would love it, but I don't think I'm going to have time to be able to
Okay.
get there at this
All
rate.
right, well, I do want to reassure everybody that in terms of the focus, it was for them to present the report. I don't want anybody to feel panicked as board members. We're not making any decisions here today, so, and also for anybody in the community listening. This is for us to get information, to ask questions, and I really appreciate everybody's engagement. Ms. Omish, followed by Ms. Tolan, followed by Rochelle Sizemore-Heiser.
Thank you, and thank you to the team for putting this together and highlighting the 3 priorities we should focus on as we move forward. I know the point has been made about the survey not being representative and the systemic challenges there, but I think, you know, obviously with any survey, we want to look at what are the limitations that are most salient so that we can understand what we're looking at. If we can just go to slide 25, I just wanted to, if you could, please. That's 10 seconds I claim back, but I was looking at that. Okay, so I think the point here is, you know, there are racial, you know, barriers. There are linguistic barriers that we're looking at as to how we didn't get data. But here, I want to just highlight for us to consider. What we're looking at is overwhelmingly people above the poverty line for sure, right? So that if we look at, okay, below 3%, who qualifies for the poverty line is significant, is very low, let's say 20 or lower, okay, depending on how many kids you have and all. And to qualify as like FRM, free and reduced meals, right, you have to be 130%. So the reason I'm pointing this out is the families that are in that category in the survey are essentially zero. Even less than that 3%. And so if we, slide 24, please, this matches with, this is consistent with what we see here, where regions 2 and 3, where the overwhelming majority of our Title I schools are located, have a significant dip in participation, okay? So what I take from this is the limitation of our data is we're looking overwhelmingly at wealthier families on this. And that's fine, it is what it is, we understand that. But that's something we have to keep in mind as we look. But what's encouraging is that despite that, I was, you know, impressed to see slide 33 where almost 35% of our families actually considered boundary change the first option for adjusting, you know, things. I want to elevate that. I also thought it was significant that, you know, you mentioned considering the 3 priorities. Slide 36, almost 60% of our families chose equity-related reasons that justify boundary changes. These are things we have to pay attention to, folks, despite, you know, even though it's a subset. This is significant. And then the other thing that I want to also ask you about, nearly a third believe in an annual change, which I thought was impressive. So folks who thought either on a need basis or every year that boundaries should be adjusted. I'm not saying that, obviously, you know, we're not making any decisions here, but this actually was surprising to me to see how willing the community is broadly as we think about best practices to move in that direction. Which brings me to a question to you related to, bear with me one second. Yeah, I want to, can you give us some context around timelines in terms of what other divisions do across the country, what's normal? I know some localities in California actually it becomes a normal part of their process where every year you just find out what school you're going to and that's just what it is. But I'm not, again, not suggesting anything here, but I want to put it into perspective. Can you please give us some feedback on that?
So the 5-year review is the most typical and would be best practice. And really, that 5-year review, in a lot of ways, in implementation, looks a lot like a 7-year review, because you're reviewing after 5 years. Well, and you might be waiting 2 years to implement based upon that, and then the next 5-year. So you almost have a 5-year review implanted within a 7-year window of time as you're moving forward. Definitely, it's not something you want to do every year. That causes a lot of disruption among families, and overwhelmingly nationally right now, the moves have been toward equity. You know, and I'm not talking about something that was not familiar to this region of the country as well, but a lot of boundary policy stems out of desegregation orders from the late 60s, early 70s, that in many cases were then struck down by the Supreme Court, and now equitable models have had to be implemented, and those equitable models are reviewed typically about every 5 years. For that, you ask another question as well. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, in terms of what others do in that regard. But my final question, and I'll use my time that was running for slide 27, we see that almost a half of families do this because of the advanced academic programming. And then overwhelmingly more than half do it for academic programming in general. And we all talked about how that's expensive, how keeping under-enrolled areas or not, maximizing on what's available is expensive. Can you speak to that piece in terms of, what the consequences, the impacts of AAP, where you see that fitting? Like, some localities call it gifted and talented, whatever you may call it, advanced academics. How it plays out generally from what you see.
So as we work with districts, divisions across the nation, it is a go-to recommendation of ours that you provide equitable access to specialized programs, whether that be something like AEP or International Baccalaureate or STEM education or performing arts. And what you see in a lot of larger districts that implement this is they look for centralized or regionalized programs for those, in an ability to balance, and there's a very practical side to it, to balance enrollment. What is most important around that is that and I'm using terms about places that I know about in Fairfax County, but just because I know them, but if you put something in Springfield and then you put it in Falls Church and you put it in Tyson's Corner, what you have to watch is that you have equitably provided for each of those. If you're putting a performing arts school in 3 different locations, is a student at Springfield getting the same education at Falls Church that the same education at Tyson's Corner? But that is what we see, where centralized at best, regionalized many times as a matter of efficacy and efficiency for transportation.
Yeah, I think that's particularly poignant.
Ms. Amish,
Yeah.
You're good.
Okay.
You're good for now. I'm happy to give you a go back. I'm going to write you down no matter what. Get a go back. Ms. Tolan, followed by Ms. Sizemore-Heiser, then I have Ms. Marin and Ms. Pekarski.
Okay, lots to cover. Thank you very much for gathering all this data. I think just with the overview, sort of an overbrush, and looking at some of the things, and as Dr. Anderson mentioned, I was one of the school board members that had a boundary change, a high school boundary change this year that we implemented. And things that showed up here on slide 36 as important considerations were things that came out as key priorities for us. No split feeders, neighborhoods staying together, things like that, reduced travel time. So given some of that, given the experience that I've had with the boundary change, and then looking through the overall view of the data, I feel like one thing it did is it tell us that even our current boundary policy is pretty good. Maybe we need to make some changes around administrative and expedited boundary changes. We've talked about that, limiting that to be more transparent. I'm not talking about the emergency situations, but just being extremely transparent. One of the things that really struck me, and I appreciated the conversation earlier about this really is a systemic view. There are lots and lots of things to consider here. So one of the things we have started work on is a program review, if my colleagues will recall. And people really, it comes out very clearly in here too. And if you've read the comments, I mean, actually, sit down. I found it quite helpful. Thank you very much for that compendium of like 100 pages of, what people actually said in their comments. A lot of people are looking for availability of programs across the district. I mean, and we talked this morning about the academy. Dranesville has no academies and no IB program. Those are just examples. So, I'm feeling like we have a lot of things going on, and it's like a chicken and egg thing. But before we are really dealing with boundaries, I would really like us to finish our work on our program review to look at what programs we have and where they are in the county. And, we have even a situation right now in McLean with a very overcrowded school with the French immersion program. There's just lots to think about before we would just say, well, let's change the boundary for that school. We need to really look at programs and finish up this program review. And we were talking about STEM programs, language programs, AAP. A question that I have for you that has not come up yet, which is another area that is huge in our county that we really, really need to be looking at, is development. We have pockets in our county. We have a relatively new silver line running through our whole county with a lot of development. How do we really look at long-range planning around that development? We're talking about looking at our student yield formulas, lots of long-range work. How do we tie that in?
So if we were doing a boundary study for you, which to echo what Mr. McLaughlin said, is not what we did, where we would be making one of the things we would do is an in-depth demographic study, looking at housing starts, looking at industry starts. We use a service called MC that has very up-to-the-date census and economic data, and then helps us forecast forward off of. That you have to take those things in mind. The other thing too is that's why a 5-year review is so important, is that you're doing that every 5 years, because things happen. 2 years ago, no one would have predicted that there were going to be 10,000 less students in Fairfax County than there are today. That's a once in a generational type of situation, but you do see those, especially in an area like Fairfax, with many different areas close to a major urban and economic center, where we're literally, like you said, a metro line can change the entire makeup of a community. Did that answer your question?
It's tough. Okay, see, my time's long gone.
Would you like to go back?
Please.
Okay. Thank you. So I have Ms. Sizemore-Heiser, Ms. Marin, Ms. Prakarsky, Ms. Derenak-Kofax, and then the meeting managers.
Thank you. And I'll pick up gladly where Ms. Tolan left off, because I think you have, to steal Dr. Brabrand's phrase, I think one of the biggest nuggets in this, I know, I'm so sorry, is the 5-year review, right? Because I think that's so crucial, to make sure that our community is sort of, they now expect it, right? Every 5 years we're going to look at this. We know this is coming. I think it helps address some of what Dr. Anderson and Ms. Tolan mentioned about, who starts this? Is it a board member? How does it work? The angst that might cause a community when there is a need to look at, we know every 5 years. There still may be, of course, things that happen in between, but we know every 5 years we have. So I think that's a really important piece. But I did want to say what Ms. Tolan said too. So many of these pieces were talked about in the program review, and part of the program review we started, right? It's really hard to talk about overutilization and underutilization without understanding the impact of programs on utilization, right? So I think it's really, there's some comments when we did the program review about wanting to focus on the basics, but I think what we see here is that reviewing program impacts so many of areas of work that we do, whether it's capacity, boundary, CIP, that it's infused in everything. So I really appreciate the times that you talk about where our programs are. I appreciate, they said that 45% of the people who responded here when they are going out of their base school is because of accessing some of those programs. The other piece that I wanted to sort of just flag, if you mentioned the survey that if a school is over capacity, 30% said their highest priority is, sort of not changing boundaries, or changing boundaries, which I find really interesting given sort of the responses of the surveys. I'm wondering, when you ask the questions, were there clarifying questions, right? Like, for example, building can take years. So if you choose building, understand you may not get relief for 3-5 years. I'm wondering if those questions were asked in the survey.
Those questions were not asked in the survey. However, and I don't want to say that if we were doing a full-scale boundary study, one of the things we would recommend are focus groups.
Yeah.
And those focus groups get into a lot more qualitative responses, similar to what Ms. Tolan said about the comments that you see from the community engagements and the surveys. That's what you start listening for, and we start building patterns around that, because that is, I think you bring up a really good point. If you decided you wanted to build a school today and it was an elementary school, the kindergartners would be the only kids that are likely going to be going to school in 5th grade.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think, when we're looking to get community feedback, I think it's important for the community to say, this option will not get you relief, will bring relief to the community in 2, 3, 4 years. This option, I think that's an important thing to have. So I just point that out there. And then I think, the only other point that I really wanted to make is when you talk about equity of specialized programming, right? Make sure there's access. That's another thing that goes back to that program review of where do we have, what do we have, where do we have it, and how do we ensure that equity? It's hard to have that conversation. So I think it's just, there's so many pieces that I feel like need to be teased out more. But I don't know if you have any suggestions on how you start this process, right? You talk about a 5-year, you talk about these factors. How do we start building towards that?
So one of the first things we would do if we were doing a boundary study is we would give you a state of the way things are. And not that the administration doesn't know, but we can give you we would give you a third-party objective statement of, here are your buildings you have, here's under capacity, here's over capacity. We would heat map it on a map of the county, showing you where the overcapacity buildings were, where the undercapacity buildings were as well. We would show you what the projections look like for the future, and to the best we could, even for specific regions of the county, in population growth, aging, those type of things. The other thing that we would look at as part of that is a little like program review. You have these magnet programs, and you really look at it from an economics of supply and demand. That, you have 3 magnet programs across the county. All 3 are under enrollment. If they were one school, though, they would be at capacity. Or here's a program, and we're not seeing student success inside of it. Is it really a viable program? So that would be one of the other things that we would look at, because it's not just about buildings. It's about what happens inside those buildings in so many cases.
That sounds like a lot of work. I will yield my 1 second back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Sizemore-Heiser. Ms. Marin, followed by Ms. Burkarski, and then Ms. Dearnett-Kofax.
Yeah, thanks. I have a question for our board governance chair, a question for Mr. Plattenberg and possibly Mr. Smith, and then some comments. So the first is about governance. We have to, as a practice, ensure that we are keeping with our duty to review our policies. It's not okay that this policy of 8130 has not been reviewed since 2013. Our governance manual and now our professional experts tell us we have to do this. So Ms. Cohen is governance chair of only just a few months, though. If you could tell us what is being done to plan for, the short term and long term in terms of getting through the queue of policies we need to review.
Yeah, first of all, I don't know when this policy was last reviewed. That's our obligation, is to review it every 5 years. So we'd have to look and see, I'm sure.
It was 2013.
Probably 2013, okay. So, yes, I totally agree with you. And walking in, and I know that I speak for Mr. Frisch, who I inherited the committee from, you know, we both have walked in with this huge volume of no change and, or minimal change policies to be reviewed, in addition to all the board work that comes obviously to the governance committee. So one thing that we've tried to do this year is add additional meetings that are just focused on burning through those no change, minimal change policies, because I totally agree with you. As a rule follower, it's like I really struggle when things have been in there for 5 years. So for us, we're trying to speed up the efficiency of the committee to get through all of those. And some of it, I think, unfortunately, just means, and I'm grateful to the folks on the committee with me who've been kind enough to agree to additional meetings, because once a month is not enough to do both of those jobs.
Thank you. And I don't know if it's Dr. Brabrand or Mr. Smith, you know, how are you all pushing on us to keep current? And do we have some master list of tracking for what needs to happen? What's the staff role here in keeping us good on
So
our
the best way I can explain it, we have a tracking to review policies X number of years. Some policies, when we review them, we say no change. Part of what happened, again, just transparently, was board members were asked, probably, I don't know, Carl may even be able to add, a year or so ago, if you wanted to talk about it or review and make sure it's not just going through as a no change, it went to governance. Hence, it grew, and now they've got to work to shrink down that list. But we're moving through it about as fast as I've observed in the 5 years that I've worked with the board. But Mr. Frisch? May I yield my time to Mr. Frisch for a moment?
I don't mind. Look, that's not my time.
The reason that we're having this conversation now is because of actions taken in 2018, which delayed the official action by the governance committee on the policy. The full board requested this process. So that's why it hasn't gone through the normal 5-year review since 2018. COVID kind of slowed everything down a bit, right, as it did everything else, but that's why the years don't line up as they should.
Okay, thanks for all that information. I appreciate it. And I love a good governance conversation, so I'd love to help if I can as a non-sitting member. To Mr. Plattenberg, I would like to know, does facilities present any quarterly or annual report of the number of administrative placements? Now, I believe we don't do that anymore, but the policy could direct to see, you know, where case-by-case changes were made and the details. So I'm not sure if that'd be relevant anymore, but do we have that data?
Yeah, we have a slide that's in the proposed that shows the reasons for any transfer or any motion, and also has administrative placements, so.
Yeah, I'm talking real specific. I've had people call and say, oh, I work here, I would like my kids to go here. Or, you know, is it a principal who's got a student in a place? You know, I think it would be good to understand.
We give examples, and the actual follow-on of all the details can be inquired with the appropriate department. But for the CIP, we just have the total numbers for administrative placement, transfer program, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, I'll probably follow up with you on that a little bit more. And does, Mr. Plattenberg, does FCPS partner with the county's Geographic Information System staff, the GIS staff, to help with our planning?
Yes, in fact, we do an annual review of our CIP, we do a 5-year forecast, everything that's being talked about. We do all of our capacities based upon building and program. And but yes, we do. That's one of the criteria, and you'll see in our CIP document, it references all the different criteria that we take a look at, not only the cohort survival, birth decay, the new growth and new development, but working with the county as well. In fact, they come and they present to this body each year regarding new growth and areas that are showing what we anticipate potential student yields may be.
Okay, and gosh, I'd be remiss if I say I sure wish there weren't some gas-powered lawn equipment behind us. It's a good thing we're addressing that as part of a pilot to have electric-powered lawn equipment. Anyhow, I digress.
Did that just for you.
I would like to say a few things. Per the report, yes, let's change that language about public notice that's in page 5 of your report to be up to the times and not just posting in newspaper. I think it's an interesting idea to have the policy include how capacity is formulated. I think that gets to the heart of some of the questions and we've been talking about. And yes, again, in your recommendations, number 4, about centralize, regionalize, or duplicate the programs. Ms. Tolan just most recently spoke about it. This spreading out the programs, increasing access related to the program review, let's be really thoughtful about all that. So for me, when I think about, the boundary policy and the values I want to put forth, it's fostering neighborhood schools, and yet reducing high poverty concentrations in our schools. There's a way to do both those things, to have neighborhood schools and not have pockets of poverty, which we know are the drivers, not race, but poverty. And we should also avoid interrupting our middle school and high school students and special education programs. I think the other related policies to this one is class sizes, making smaller class sizes, and then the virtual use and non-traditional use. Let's take the investments we made during COVID and wrap that into these conversations about how they can mitigate boundary and capacity issues. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ms. Marin. I now have Ms. Pekarski, then Ms. Dearnach-Kofax.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to both of you. This was an excellent presentation, and I think it was very clearly laid out. And thank you to our meeting managers for helping make sure that today went smoothly and we were able to take in the information. I think there's been some good conversations so far. As Ms. Marin actually brought up, I do have a lot of interest around capacity and who does that assessment, what does that look like, and how does that factor into what we do. I think with this many schools, that's a critical piece for us. So if you have anything to add on that, I would be interested.
I think from a capacity standpoint, and where it gets murky, and that's where there has to be the articulation and the definition, is when you get to programmatic capacity, when you talk about class size. That was alluded to just a few minutes ago as well. You've just got to make sure that you define, this is how capacity is defined for a specific building, and then not to overcomplicate things, is based upon that, do you have the right programs in the right buildings? If they are specialized programs, is there room to expand somewhere else, or could you use a smaller space if a program does not have overwhelming capacity needs?
Not to get too granular, but I guess my question is who does that? Is that the administrator? Do we bring people in that, can look at all the different schools? How is that done best practice-wise?
Best practice, and I believe from one of the things that I should have said that leaves us at a little bit of a disadvantage in presenting is some of the work that we did was literally done in the spring of 2020, and it's almost the spring of 2022. But I believe the district has capacity people, and it's working with them and a committee. There needs to be some of the academic folks too. I'm a former principal, and I don't think I would leave the capacity of the building up to me. Because it can be manipulated. Or the other thing as well is similar programs need to have similar capacity and similar restrictions around them. There could be a committee that decides, but at the end of the day, it really needs to land with one person and one committee where it's determined and set, and then that's it.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Mr. Plattenberg, can you kind of elaborate on what we do so I can understand, please?
I'm going to let Mr. Schuster speak to that directly.
So in the Office of Planning, we have two capacity architects that calculate the capacity for all our schools as part of the CIP process each year. So we look at the capacity, the student ratios for each programs to calculate those consistently across the division in the CIP.
But what I'd like to add is that each year we send out information requesting each principal program manager to identify the capacity and the use within their facility and the individual programs within their buildings. And that's how we incorporate in our CIP each year to take a look at what the program capacity is. It's from that feedback from the principals individually at each school that we incorporate in our proposed CIP that you'll be seeing shortly. And in addition, if there are any issues, our capacity architects work with the principals to identify location, spaces, and any conflicts that they might have to help resolution.
But it's principals giving that information at the end of the day. Okay. Okay. I am very interested in the strategic look at how we do the 5 to 10 years, maybe connected to the census. I know some of us have talked about where redistricting is also happening within Fairfax County for taking, maybe nobody wants to do boundary changes ever, but we have a finite number of resources, and our taxpayers expect us to be efficient in those resources. And I think at the end of the day, that is a big commitment that lays on the shoulders of this board. So I'm very interested in that recommendation. I'm interested in what Mr. Frisch has said with a committee structure that could be put in place to be part of that. I think that is something we need to be thinking about and talking about going forward. And I also think, we have CPDC. It is a board committee, our Comprehensive Planning Development Committee, right? I got that right? And I think maybe that is a very natural place for that committee to kind of pick up some of these recommendations and look at and try to start moving this ball forward if that's how we choose to proceed. So they have somebody on, yes. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you, Ms. Pekarsky. Ms. Derna Kofax, followed by the two meeting managers. Before you do go, X.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here and for this comprehensive report. And I have to say, while some of these things on paper look simple, I think for this community, some of these things would take great courage. Great courage. So, for instance, I will start with something. I'd like to hear more about your idea of equity. What does that mean? What are you thinking of? How does poverty play a role in this? And is it equitable to have regions that have consistently have 60% to 100% of their schools would be Title I status if we delineated them all that way, and other regions that have 0 to very few?
If I missed something, let me know. So I define equity in two ways, and when we look at equity as a company, one is equal access. And the other thing about equity is there are different schools of thought around this, but equity is not equal. It's not every region, every district gets X number of dollars. It may mean that if you have regions with higher concentration of poverty, there's also higher concentration of resources, also higher concentrations of support. That is equity. I would come back to having equitable access to specialized programs is very much part of the way that we look at equity as a company. I think, and this is me as a professional educator of almost 30 years, so sort of agnostic of MGT, but a third party coming in looking who've worked in similar district also as you're talking about. I don't have a problem with there being school district or schools that are 60 or areas that have 60% Title I schools, as long as those schools are getting the equitable resources it takes to make differences in the lives of students. Because one of the largest things that we see and hear time again, and it's something that has been brought up here, is how do we create community and family engagement? One of the ways you don't create is making it harder to be a part of the school community. And if you're doing that, the other thing too that we see districts do is sometimes they will try to dilute their poverty across schools. I wouldn't say that's best practice at all.
How would you do that?
How would you dilute poverty? You would go into your poorest neighborhoods and send kids to the four cardinal directions and others out away from their neighborhoods. That again, that's not a recommendation whatsoever. That's a what not to do in my book. It is meet children, families in the community where they are and provide the resources and the programs to provide equitable access for for all would be my recommendation.
I appreciate that. Moving on to administrative boundary things. You haven't really addressed that, or maybe I missed it. I'm sorry, I had something I had to deal with. Some of those have worked well for us, and some of those have been disastrous, with the capital letters all through it. So what are your thoughts on that? And if I missed it, I'm sorry.
So my thoughts are administrative adjustments. Our definition is a little different than Fairfax County, so we're using
Yes,
this.
you understand ours then?
Yes, I
from
understand
your
yours.
research.
So the way that I see and we see administrative adjustments should happen is those are your exemptions and your exceptions to the policy. So it would be the MGT definition of that. What it appears to me has happened is your administrative adjustments have taken the place of a 5-year review.
You're right.
And
100%.
that's, so if you were doing that year over year since 1986, there probably would be a lot fewer administrative adjustments as Fairfax County currently implements them. And that's not a accusation or a charge against anyone in the district or on the board. You know, probably the most common reason districts and boards do the things they've done is because that's what they've done. And it becomes, over time, administrations and different boards, just the way things happen. So I think there, like I said, I think there would be a lot less if there was a 5-year review with sort of that annual review that we talked about as well for acute cases that may have arisen.
Okay, that's helpful. And then finally, kind of what Ms. Pekarsky was saying, you know, after we kind of digest everything that you've presented to us and we start making decisions on your recommendations, how would a district like ours, who has not had the ability, courage, whatever you want to say, because some of it has just been, you know, not that we've put it on the back burner. There have just been thing after thing that have happened in the school system. You're dealing with lack of funding, you're dealing with all kinds of things. So with a district like ours, that what you've seen so far, that hasn't had major boundary changes in many years, how would you begin that task forward? What is your slow by slow churn, your strategic, as Ms. Pekarsky called it, strategic initiative to move forward?
So you're asking me a little bit of a loaded question here.
Why we pay you the big bucks, right?
Now, no, well, but my loaded answer to
No,
your
I
loaded
know. I'm
question
being
is
facetious,
I would
sorry.
have and this is what we did in the district I was in, and I did what Mr. Plattenberg did, and what Brian does in a large district as well. You're almost too close to it. And even if you're not too close to it and you can be objective, which I have no doubt that the district administration can be, I believe a third party coming in and guiding through the process, especially that part of here's the lay of the land. I think that true, the way I always describe it is that's basically the report you get after your checkup. And that's the first part. The second part then is what's the wellness plan based upon the checkup. But I think what I would do is I would employ a third party to come in and evaluate the current state. And honestly, part of that is probably a facilities optimization. You know, this would be one that I would probably call an enrollment boundary study and facilities optimization study as well. Deciding as a district and as a board if portable classrooms are an acceptable thing. You know, we have some districts we work with that say portable classrooms are not acceptable. We have them because they're a necessary evil, but we want a path forward within the next 10 years to not have portable classrooms. Or we need a definitive policy around when is a school no longer viable, whether that be programmatically or enrollment or facilities wise. What does that look like? And those are really tough decisions to be made from the inside out, because sadly people will think there's ulterior motives, or why was A picked instead of B? And then to the point you made earlier, I do think this is very simple work, but something can be very simple and complex at the same time. And you know, and like I said, simple is not a synonym for easy. Not easy work in the very least. The other thing that I think you could do, and you don't need a consultant to do this, is define what your policy looks like. The implementation then could be where third-party groups come in. But I think based upon the recommendations we've made, a solid policy that then has procedures put to it, that then you have a group come and help you put that into practice, that's probably the best path forward.
That was very helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay, you've got 45 seconds that will
Good right now.
hold
Thank you.
on. Okay, Ms. Keys-Gamarra.
Okay, thank you. It's been a pleasure to work with you guys. We had a couple of meetings with you, and I appreciate your patience with Megan and I as we tried to hone things out to make the most of this discussion today. As I said then, my goal in looking at this information was through the lens of understanding what happened in 2018. Right? I was fairly new to the board, and I saw how just the mention of the word, no proposal for anything, produced sheer anger and anxiety in our community. Now that we're looking at a time period where, you know, perhaps that had happened prior to my being here, and it resulted in a lack of review that perhaps has contributed to inequities in our system that we just cannot, at least I cannot, support in good conscience. So what I'm looking for now, and I believe my colleagues are, is one, to achieve greater community understanding that this is part of our responsibility. Right. And when I look at some of the information that you brought, while some may say, you know, this huge percentage says we don't want boundary changes, there's also a huge percentage that says you better not put my kid in a trailer. And I don't want them on a bus for more than 30 minutes. And these things are not necessarily, they don't work well together because those nuances don't all resolve the same way. So I guess my question to you has to do with developing a plan from here for us to continue the education of the community to understand we really do have some views that just are inconsistent with one another, right? It is probably, and I'll ask the question, I do believe that there are those in the community that will look at the outcome of this survey as a vote. But the vote outcome is inconsistent. So how can we continue that process of positive dialogue? And I guess some of my colleagues have been saying the same thing, but we're trying to get to some part where we're working in partnership with the community and not being seen necessarily as though we're causing harm.
I think one of the solutions is using the current vehicles that you have in place, whether those be the PTAs at each of the schools. You know, and like I said, it's not perfect engagement, but every school has engaged parents. Mm-hmm. You know, and I know that having been principal of a Title I school, that engagement was very important and very intentional. It had to be, but you had engaged parents, and you can get the opinion of those parents. And sometimes that's the best you can do. I'm not saying you stop trying, but you want to make sure that you're getting engagement from everyone. The other thing is move forward using the priorities that we know are best practice around equity, around stability, around efficacy, which is not just curriculum instruction efficacy, it's operational efficacy of the resources you have as a school district at your disposal, and those are finite resources. The other thing, and this is sort of an answer to your question, but also an answer to the previous question, one of the things that happens during a study, whether it's facilities optimization or enrollment boundary study, there's anywhere from 3 to 5 different scenarios that then you start getting community input on that really, because until, having done this work, like I said, in a district and now in this work, until you have scenarios to show people, some people are not engaged until they see how does this, it's one of the most basic human questions. How does this impact me and my family? And then that's, and frankly, at the end of the day, the impacted are the people that you want the most input from and what that looks like to them. And if you could, I can think of a similar study we did in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and they wanted 3 scenarios, and we called them the Goldilocks Scenarios because there was a fix everything across the district, and it had almost $1 billion price tag to it. There was the do the most efficient thing, and then do what you think is common sense, which is a little bit of efficiency and a little bit of investment. And we got input around that, and then we changed based upon even what the Goldilocks recommendation ended up being. But when it started to impact people, that's when you got your best engagement, or when it could potentially, because there is just sort of also human nature, oh, that's not going to happen to me. So, and until you see them at some of those, it's going to be difficult, because what we also have to remember, and I'm probably one of the most guilty people of this, is we all sort of have a curse of knowledge where we understand something so well, and I would put school board members in that boat. You work in this, even if it is on a part-time basis, where you're familiar with these terms, where equity has a meaning to you. When we talk about stability and we talk about efficacy, the word efficacy didn't get thrown around my home when I was a kid. That wasn't, so so if we're saying, what's most important to our families, we need to make it in a way they can understand it, and then also in a way where they can see what that impact potentially could be.
Thank you. I'm out of time. We'll see.
All right, thank you. I'll go ahead and take my turn. First of all, for years, I've been very consistent as someone who personally experienced a boundary change when I was in the 5th grade to when my children were in elementary school, and we lived in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I've shared with the prior board, Wake County Schools for decades was doing boundary changes almost on a yearly basis. It got so bad that because they were doing it on socioeconomic busing changes, that people just voted out the whole school board, or they pulled their kids out and sent them to Catholic school, even when their kids weren't Catholic. The strength of our public schools here in Fairfax County, a lot of it does have to do with neighborhood schools and stability. There's no 2 ways around it, and I've been very happy that that was my children's experience, and one of the reasons when I looked at where I would raise a family, it showed up in our surveys. I will note, TJ, if you look at the TJ response, next to nothing. And yet that is some of our highest performing, well-off families with the lowest poverty in the entire district. It's because it doesn't affect them. It's a magnet school. So I appreciate that our consultant is pointing that out. We are the 10th largest school system in the country. It means we're complex. We have 200 schools with 200 boundaries. We have to take a scalpel, not an axe, to anything that we address on this issue. I will say, starting at the most macro level, when you name off that a boundary policy must be grounded in the following 3 areas, if they're all to be able to work in harmony together, it goes with your definition of what equity is, that we want each and every child to have equitable access to high-quality schools. Stability and efficacy lends itself to those neighborhood schools that we're talking about. Community schools were not mentioned, but it is very related. We know that the strength of really lifting up our children, particularly in poverty, is the community schools where they can access the school not just for children, but for their families. So I would ask my colleagues that going forward, and we're going to have a board briefing on it, That's what makes this work so complex. It's not so simple because so many things are intertwined in how we do this, and we do it well for all kids. I will express my disappointment that I have said over and over again to our staff, and it's not in this report either. The psychological impact on students on instability is real. Foster children, who are dealing with homelessness, that instability is hard on them. And there's nothing in here that talks about the psychological impact of changing boundaries. So with 13 seconds left, I will say, I absolutely support boundary review. 10 years on this board, Mr. Plattenberg, I have found your team comes to us all the time and says, under capacity, over capacity, what do we need to do in your district? I think we've been doing that, and I'll take a go back and go to my colleagues now for their go backs. Mr. Frisch, followed by Ms. Cohen, followed by Ms. Omish, Ms. Tolan, and then I have Ms. Pekarsky.
Thank you. I'm happy to follow Ms. McLaughlin. Following up on her comment about TJ, which I found interesting to not see it there. Were they included in the survey since they don't have a boundary? They were?
All families were included.
Okay. And would they show up under TJ or underneath what would have been their base school?
They would show up under TJ, wouldn't they? Because
Okay.
yeah,
They are? Oh, okay, I just didn't see it. All right. This is a sliver. In terms of community engagement, I think one thing that we come back to over and over and over again is the depth of our community engagement. I know that the Governance Committee has sent the family engagement policy to the full board for a work session in the future. I would like to have future conversations with OCCR to make sure that they have the resources to engage in innovative ways of getting into the community. I know that many principals work hard to get into the community using email or text message. That just doesn't cut it with certain families. So we need an innovative approach that we routinely deploy to get the highest number of people responding. I also think that we need to investigate representative sampling for these studies so that they have weight to them. We routinely use these as stand-ins for what people assume is representative sampling. We say things like, families want X. That's never true of any survey that we do. Families that responded to this want X, and they're rarely representative of the entire community. They are representative of a part of the community. So I hope we can continue to have conversations around that. I did look at the current policy, and from my perception, it appears we added expedited boundary adjustments and standard boundary adjustments in 1998, but that the policy has not been touched other than that since 1986, which means that no elected school board has ever revised this policy other than those two additions. This board became elected in the mid-90s, 1995, I believe. So the last time it was substantively tackled was by an appointed board. And I think there's appetite for this conversation, which I think is encouraging. That said, the policy was reviewed in 2013 and continued forward. So I'm eager to have more conversations about what can be done. My clock is, I'm getting infinity time. This is great. It says 2 minutes. Oh, I'm done. Can you give some examples of the innovative ways that politicians are taking themselves out of the process and encouraging community involvement, like I talked about in my previous questions?
I think it would very much be what we were talking about. It's a cross-functional, very diverse group of people who become educated on the very things I just educated you on, and I think that becomes part of a study, because there's a democracy to this that you want. There's also a pragmatism that you need to get things moving forward. You know, it's the reason we're a republic and not a not a true democracy like Athens was. You know, because that would take a long time to get that work done. But I think as scenarios start getting built out, it would be great to have a community work group around that, made up of the groups that I talked about. That group could also take field trips to other districts to see how they've accomplished this work and how they're doing it, because, you know, as I shared with the meeting managers and I've shared with you, the best practice that's best for Fairfax is what's best for your community. But seeing the ways that others have worked through this practically, I think is important, because then the other thing you can hear are the pitfalls they've ran into with the priorities that they've made.
Thank you.
Ms. Cohn?
I'm just going to piggyback and say we already have, as part of FPAC, and we have Kathy Hosick sitting right back here, so I'm going to pick on her, a boundary committee with people who, my hand to God, know the CIP not quite as well as Jeff Plattenberg, but man, they're right underneath you about where the boundaries are. And so it's been such an amazing resource that as we've had these couple of things these last year, of just being able to say to our colleagues, like, have you talked to the boundary folks to get their 2 cents? And I think their feedback has been invaluable about exactly what you said, knowing the details of what communities maybe, when you look at a map, do not interact together. But and we just saw it, some criticism about how some of the maps have come out now for political boundaries, has been that people who live and work and play together should get to go to school together, should be represented by the same people. And so I think that has kind of been the consistent message here, is that we don't always know that unless you're in the committee. So just super quick, and my time didn't start, but I was not telling you till I was done with that point, is I would just really like to encourage my colleagues a few things. One, I know PEC's working on what advisory committees that we have. I would love a conversation that we elevate the subcommittee of FPAC that's boundaries to actually being its own standalone advisory. If we're going to tackle this and we're going to say that every 5 years we're looking at this, and maybe it's something you throw into place every 3rd year or something, like maybe it's not 5 years, but in having someone who directly, instead of their work goes through FPAC, goes through the FPAC liaison, or they create their own separate report that influences with Jeff Shop of how we make these decisions. But my colleagues, like, I'd just really like us to think about how we come together. No one's listening to me except Elaine, but that we come together and look at engaging on the enrollment and facilities optimization study. A lot of our frustration, I think universally, with the program presentation we got, nothing against Sloan, but we wanted someone to come in and say, hey, all of these programs have their own unique constituencies. Nobody's ever gonna, we could fill this with Jell-O and people fight over whether FLES or strings or, immersion is what's on the table. Like that, no one's ever gonna agree that their program doesn't cut the mustard and we should get rid of it. So I think that we collectively, this is a conversation that going forward, kind of for all things, having a third party outside group to look at facilities optimization is something we all, I think, have been talking about for a long time. So I guess I would like to ask respectfully, whoever's in charge of this, Stella, what's the next step for us as a board? How do we move from this, take this in? I know we're not deciding it today, but what's even the process of engaging? Is it a forum topic that somebody brings back and says, hey, we'd like to do enrollment and facilities optimization study? Just functionally, I could use help in figuring that out.
We'd plan to do some next steps on what, direction, because in all fairness to our chair and vice chair, it's an administrative role. They don't make decisions for what the board will and won't do, but
no, I
we
didn't
need
mean
to
it
give
like
them.
that. No, I didn't mean it like that. I just meant, what's the vision of, like, how do we, I don't want this to be left today and we walk away and 3 years from now, a new board says, oh, you know what, maybe we should have a conversation about boundaries. Like,
Oh, absolutely.
how do
We wanted to make sure that was part of the wrap up today.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So I like your next steps. I do. So can you write them down and pass them on a yellow piece of paper so I cover them?
Your time expired.
Yeah. Man, Carmen's
Okay, I have Ms. Omish, followed by Ms. Tolan, and then Ms. Pekarsky.
Thank you. Still trying to be mindful of limitations always as we embark on potential steps. The access issues that we were talking about with the survey are going to be the same access issues with any boundary process that we set up, So I wanted to ask you, what are some of those, what are the consequences of opening it up, and how that might actually undermine those 3 priorities, especially equity?
So as I think as you build out scenarios with these, so one of the things that we do, so let's I'll make up a school name, and hopefully it is not anyone in Fairfax, because that way, so Norton Commons Elementary School, not one in
Good,
Fairfax.
you're
Is there?
good.
Okay.
Keep going.
So if we're gonna make a recommendation that impacts Norton Commons Elementary School, that's where you have the community engagement in that community, or in the community that goes to Norton Commons Elementary School. You know, that's what that targeted engagement looks like, because I'm gonna say we could do just about any survey on just about any topic within Fairfax County, and if there's not a whole lot of more intentionality, way, like I said, outside of the scope of what we were contracted to do, it's gonna look a lot like that. You know, typically the people who take surveys are the people who take surveys. And you've got to, like, when it comes down to impact, you just can't rely on district-wide survey. It has to be targeted at that point. You have to have the focus groups. You have to hear people's comments. The other thing that any scenarios you build out, this, as I said earlier, is purely just not an efficiency exercise. It's what are the added benefits. You know, that anytime you make a decision like this, no community should be impacted in a way that could be perceived as negatively, without positive impacts also being articulated and defined for the community. We're making this decision that causes these consequences, but also as a result of this decision, we've now freed up X number of dollars that are now being invested in this. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I mean, I guess, so if you can elaborate maybe more on targeted, or, you know, what are there principles for how to operate in this realm? Are there best practices? Because you're going to end up putting out the survey to the community. You're going to end up saying, okay, we have a community event, the same, you know, English-speaking, wealthier, that wealthy neighborhood in the school zone is going to show up. You know, I mean, it's the typical thing. And then you end up making, and when equity is a priority for why we're doing boundaries, you end up making boundary decisions that are counter to that goal. And we end up where we are, where we're, you know, 20, 30 years after no boundary conversation happened because it's too politically difficult. And we're exacerbating, you know, all kinds of, inequitable realities.
Well,
Right?
and I'll go back to, that's where you have to be intentional in those communities until you feel like you've gotten the input that is representative, or where you're right. And again, when you make when you have scenario-based planning, at that point it becomes a whole lot more focus grouped. And the whole purpose of a focus group is that focus of making sure that you have the populations and the communities involved that need to be. You know, there's no harm in a wholesale survey, but you also need to have the background information that we have, seeing who's filled that out, seeing who the opinion comes from. And in that case too, where it becomes more targeted, is you would want to be able to trace, this is someone who has kids who attend Thomas Jefferson, and then they feel this way, you know, where it becomes a whole lot more disaggregated at that point.
Yeah, how does that compare to maybe just an independent group of folks who look at this from certain, you know, angles of expertise, as opposed to maybe a community-based process? Because I'm concerned that even the data we would collect, we don't know what we don't know, right? We're only having certain conversations in 2021 because certain types of people started showing up at the table, and we're going to continue like that. You know, so I worry about that.
So two things. The people who do what we do, and my team that I have, they are experts in this work, but I would feel very presuming to come in, take your feedback, and say, now here's your plan, without getting your community's input on the scenarios of the plan. And at that point, you know, because do I have full confidence in the plan that we would bring forward? Yes, but similar to what I keep bringing up, every community is so unique that there isn't a one-size-fits-all, and moreover, there's probably 3 or 4 sizes that accomplish the same goal. But then it becomes, what is the community like, and then what also The other thing where we have to work then in partnership with the school administration, with the school board, is this actionable? Is this something that we can do? Yeah, you know, because the easiest thing, and to Ms. McLaughlin's point, this is very surgical, not in a lumberjack fashion, because the easiest thing to do would be what I always like to call the Walt Disney model, is where he took a swamp and turned it into Disney World, and where we would say, okay, here's Fairfax County, here's all the kids, you need a school here, and that's not actionable. But it would provide just a Shangri-La type of solution. So I think that's why running scenarios and then getting input on those scenarios from the communities that are impacted is the way to go.
Okay, so that's helpful. So then how do we square that with, you know, earlier you mentioned something about how it's kind of the residue of segregation that we're looking at still with the socioeconomic and everything. And then I still go back to the fact that our academic programming, namely AAP, is what guides where people move. I mean, almost half of folks, that's how they decide their boundary. Can you speak a little bit to how that fits in with what you just shared? Because we already know equity is an issue for AAP in general. And then if we're looking at that's the reality of even boundaries, I'd love to hear, you know, your thinking around that. And that's different than general academic programs, right? And then I don't know, you know, Jeff, if you can also speak to just the expense associated with that from a busing perspective, given what we saw in the survey.
So quick point of clarification. 88% of families choose their base school. Of the 12% that don't, that's the half that choose a specialized program as the reason they aren't choosing their base school. So 54% of 12%.
Most of that is SPED, not AAP.
So the overwhelming majority, 88% of families are base school choosing within Fairfax. There's really not a whole lot more to say around that, but one of the things you do find is people who will vote with their feet. And in almost every community, you have to take that into account as well, because you want to make sure that you have options and choices for families that just as soon could leave if they don't feel like their student need is being met. And that's a major endorsement of specialized programs, but that should be centralized or regionalized, where they're also efficient uses of resources are able to carry those out.
Jeff,
Great, thank you.
I had asked him to address it.
You asked Jeff, okay. Quickly, because we've really got to wrap up by 5 o'clock.
I don't have the answer to what the cost is for transporting for AAP right now.
Okay.
Again, it was about 6% that we found in the survey, at least.
Correct.
And I believe it's about $1 million in past for busing.
And that,
Oh.
and that data is outdated, just like the one that was quoted before about the percent of transport and how much, yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, the last we had before the great pandemic. Okay, Ms. Tolan, followed by Ms. Pekarsky, and then Ms. Kieskamar and I have our wrap-up second round.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like I know too much about this because too many things are swimming around. First of all, Abrar, let me just say that the programs that they're talking about, it's not only AEP, it's STEM, academies, IB, et cetera. It's any kind of specialized program. So that percentage is for all of those. You know, I think if we're going to look at putting together a group or something to look at this, I feel like it needs to be, I liked the term facilities optimization, because it's not just boundaries, right? It's like we've been talking, it's programs, it's capacity. I'm so happy, as McLaughlin brought up the community schools, which we'll be talking about next month. I mean, that's a very powerful program, really shows how keeping people in their base school community is so important, and what kinds of ways we can partner with, in the broader sense, with Fairfax County, et cetera, to provide services for the families that really, really need them. As I mentioned previously, development is a huge issue. So I don't know, Mr. Plattenberg, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we have like pieces going on in various different parts of our county, our different committees, et cetera. Is there a way we can pull these topics together to kind of start looking long-term at this issue?
Well, that was the beauty of the comment that was raised before about the continuation. Next steps, what do we do? And having a group like MGT, not necessarily that group, but they are well-versed, and taking a look holistically from that objective perspective. The reference was made by FPAC and the use of them. FPAC was originally designed to provide guidance on boundaries. That was the whole purpose of FPAC. Now it's grown, and they're charged each year to take a look at a number of different things, and we've been very fortunate for that. But getting back to the main thing being the main thing, and having an outside group come in and help navigate what the board should be looking at in terms of policy, how to assist with outreach, as far as next steps, I think those are all excellent ideas, what I've been hearing. So I just think having that come together from that facilities, that master plan perspective, I think would be definitely beneficial. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I was thinking.
I guess we would really have to think about how that could be done and what groups we would put together. And let me just ask the usual question. We're dealing with a lot of issues with COVID, still, huge issues around transportation, from the facilities perspective, numbers around, uncertainty in, where our kids are, not to mention the work we really need to be doing on academics and social-emotional, the whole social-emotional side of it. Where do you see this work fitting in with all of that?
Well, that's one thing that, Ms. McLaughlin had been speaking about from the beginning. How do we assess the social-emotional impacts on these? Again, that is way out of my lane. In terms of having a group like ORSI take a look at what social-emotional impacts are there, I'm not aware in the 36 years of my facilities background of too many studies that have been made talking about the social-emotional. I am aware in 96, around 2000, there were studies that were done that talked about the impact of new facilities, lighting, on the diverse learners, for example, providing comfortable spaces for those, because we're all individualized learners. If I need an open lit space, if I need a more reclusive space, depending on my learning style, about that impact of the facilities. But I haven't seen and wouldn't really just profess to know of the social emotional impact that I totally agree is an important concept that isn't here. And I think, and I know, when you look at the charge that was asked of the board, it didn't focus on that. So one of the good outcomes of this conversation is, you heard it, next steps. How do we get someone to coalesce? How do we take our these concepts, great information, how do we go ahead and then work as a body? Do we get a facilitator that helps us guide us along that path? I would submit yes, I think that's a great idea. And do we incorporate things such as social emotional impact? Because that hadn't been as high a criteria, but it's something that we have seen, especially as a result of this pandemic, the impact of social emotional issues on change. In fact, on all of us. So it's a great point.
So I know that was super interesting. That was a great point. But my question maybe was more for Dr. Brabrand. Just where does the work fit in with everything else? And then I know I'm done.
Thank you,
Well-
Ms. Tolan, I understand.
I would say this, today was to present the report and hear the information. We need to figure out the game plan. I've heard themes today, but I think we need time as an administrative team, just like you reflected, to reflect and come up. I hear the power of a third party. I hear the power of telling the community the regular pace of when we are going to entertain this work. That's part of the problem that we've had, to be honest. We need to be transparent with the parameters. I think we need a third-party guide. And I think we can figure that out and wrap it up before I walk away from here, so that the new superintendent and this board doesn't have to start from scratch around how we're going to move forward. But I don't have all those answers today. I'd like to take time to really reflect on this report now. There were some changes made. Meeting managers and all of us gave some feedback here at the end. There's some pieces in here I want to reflect on with the team, but I think it is using a third party. I think it is coming to a regular time, and I think it's doing multiple pieces. Looking at the capacity, looking at programs, just like Ms. Marin said, we looked at programs, but in isolation from all the other things. We've got to figure out how we pull it together and come up with a longer-term plan.
Great. Ms. Tolan, to your question, we're going to get through everybody's second turn, and then, we're just going to present for you all to just vote yes or no. But I think what we're just really looking at is this was part A. Part B is we need staff to now give us their analysis of the feedback from the consultant. And that's when then we can collectively hear from the consultant, then from staff, and then how we want to operationalize going forward from this. And I just see a future work session coming out of it. But I do want to give everybody their last 2 minutes. So I've had 2 more people add their time back up. So I have Ms. Pekarsky followed by Ms. Corbett-Sanders and then Ms. Derenak-Kofax. 2 minutes, everybody.
Okay.
And if you can, speak more and ask questions less. That might get us through faster. What I mean is, or they need to keep their answers short.
Okay, I don't have questions, so I'm going to speak. There's just some things I wanted to lift up, namely what you said about boundaries being difficult for families. I think that is one of those nuggets that we have to lift up because it is traumatic for families, because our administrators and our teachers do such a wonderful job creating communities, and boundaries disrupt communities. And I appreciate you saying it. I think it's necessary to acknowledge that again for those listening. I also appreciated what you said about a best practice not being diluting poverty, because at the end of the day, I think what equity is for me, and I know that's a conversation we obviously need to have, but it's investing in every single community, in every single school, so that children can have access to their neighborhood school and have the resources and the programs they need. And I guess for me, that is my interest at the end of the day. How do we not disrupt neighborhoods, communities? We'll have the opportunity, I know, to speak a little bit more to this as we have our CIP discussions, we have our neighborhood schools discussion. I do see space for a future work session, but I also see space, and I don't direct anything, but I see space for CPDC to look at some of these things and maybe bring something forward to us in the work that you all do. So that's it. I'll leave that there. Thank you so much. This was really an excellent discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Pekarsky. Ms. Corbett-Sanders.
Great, and I'm happy to follow Ms. Pekarsky because one of my concerns is exactly that, communities, and creating communities where our kids are in the community in which they live and that they go to school. Too often we have these very long commutes on buses for kids to be bused from one area to another. And those kids spend a lot of time on buses, and their families don't necessarily have easy access to schools. And so I would suggest that part of the conversation on boundary policy also addresses that piece, which is the optimum time or the maximum amount of time we want kids on buses. And so I like the idea of CPDC picking this up and doing some additional work. And I would just urge that every child deserves to be in their community when they go to school.
Thank you, Ms. Corbett-Sanders. Ms. Derenak-Kofax.
Thank you. I just wanted to speak a little bit to what Dr. Brabrand was talking about, the social emotional. And I don't know, I think it might be a combination of CPDC, because what I've seen through the years, and this is not to be disparaging, our FPAC committee was established to look at boundaries, but what they then didn't look at is the social and emotional impact. And so we have had siloed groups who are doing their best work, but they are doing it in a siloed way. So I'm not exactly sure if I would assign this to CPDC without talking to somebody from instructional services, without bringing, but we have not done that, okay? We are all saying yes, yes, but we have not done that. FPAC has brought us recommendations, CPD has instructional services have, they're not meshing. And we've just paid a consultant, and we appreciate your work very much to tell us this is what best practices are. And the equity piece is so, so important. And it's equity for all, whether you need advanced learning, whether you need to be met in the middle, or whether you need remediation. It is not just one thing. It cannot be siloed, and it cannot, and if the needs of the building are, say one portion of the population is a greater percentage of the population, what typically has happened, and I'm not saying everywhere, but it is just because we're so big and because the funding hasn't always been there. But the majority population then might get what they need, but then there might be another, and I don't mean that in terms of race or ethnicity, I just mean the number of people at that school got what they needed, while those people who were less numbers of them, they might not have. So that is important. Boundaries play a part in it. But I think as we go forward and as your team goes forward, this is more a conversation for FCPS personnel right now that I'm saying. I think we need many groups to come together before we come forward with any kind of recommendations because of the siloed approach that I've seen before. Not intentional, good work, but needs to look at the whole perspective. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Keys-Gamarra, you and I get to bring it on home, so you take your 2 minutes.
Okay, Barbara wants me to take some of my seconds and say, Marty just said 5.6 million for the buses for AAP. All right, let me respond to kind of some general things here. You're correct, Ms. Derenak Kofax. This holistic approach has not taken place in the past, but part of the problem, I believe, is that the role of CPDC has been so limited. The language, if you look at the language for that, it is basically to choose the people for FPAC and to exist. And it really should bridge those gaps that you're talking about because the board perspective is necessary to address all of this. We can't simply do it with, our experts are helpful, but the board's role is essential, I think. So I would like to hear certainly what our staff, after they have time for reflection, what they would like to, what they would like to recommend. Just FYI, CPDC is reviewing their charge now, and I've already talked to Elaine, and we're going to be working together to kind of see how we can best bridge the gap between those two entities. What I think needs to happen is we need to define the process so that the community knows what to expect. That has been a big part of the problem. And so we're trying to achieve that transparency. We're trying to help people to understand what to expect. And we're also giving them an opportunity to understand, educate them with respect to that process. So I believe step one is to hear from staff, at which point the superintendent can give us a recommendation. There can be some discussion amongst our chairs who can talk to us as to what those next steps can be. In the meantime, CPDC will do their work with FPAC, and perhaps all of that can be taken into consideration. So that's kind of from my perspective where we are. Hopefully that was helpful.
Thank you. Before I make my comments, Mr. Smith, can you clarify, is that $5.6 million for AAP transportation, or is that just to run the AAP services?
That was for AAP transportation out of the program budget book.
So I remember when we first discussed maybe eliminating AAP busing transportation, and that was going to be $1 million cost savings. How did it go up 5 times that amount?
So it hasn't gone up 5 times the amount. I looked at, again, in looking at the program budget book, year over year, the costs have increased just a bit from the previous year, but that is the overall cost for AAP transportation.
Okay, I mean, I know Ms. Derenak Kofax remembers from our years of budget where that was always on the table as cut the transportation and it was $1 million, not 5.6. But I think we need to have that sorted out.
And as I recollect, in the past, we had sometimes looked at that $4 million
Stop the clock,
number.
please. Thank you.
I was saying that, as I recollect, and looking at that in the past, the number $4 million was always the number that we had floated around. But this year, in the FY22 program budget, $5.6 million.
Thank you. In terms of closing out where we are here, I'm going to, again, advocate for what Ms. Keys-Gamarra just said. I think it's premature to send it to any committee at this time. The whole point of this, from the prior board to this board, was do we want to make any changes to our boundary policy? I feel like we're starting to get too much into operational need, operational assessment, operational impact. I honestly look at the consultant's report when I think about how they've defined equity, which I hear us all in support of, and that is about giving high-quality schools to every child in Fairfax County, and then stability and efficacy in how we run our system. I honestly don't know how far we are in terms of our existing policy language, what our practice is. We could look at ways to refine it, make it more detailed, but really the next step after that would be how is staff going to take our policy and operationalize it? And that's where a lot of the analysis will be in terms of where is the need among 200 schools and those boundaries of those 200 schools to address it. I sort of feel like we keep talking about what's the problem we're trying to fix, and we know time is precious. And so the problem we're trying to fix across 200 schools is not the same problem across 200 schools. So that's my 2 cents. I really feel comfortable that we need time to come back with staff and give them, have them give us their thoughts. And then we collectively, because this policy belongs to the board, and every one of us knows, as we were just saying, when it goes to committee, that's about 3 or 4 school board members, and with everything on the committee's plates, this could take longer instead of quicker. And I really would like to see us work through this with Dr. Braybrand, given his 5 years of knowledge of the system and 20 plus 5 years of serving here. So anyway, now we're going to officially lay out for you the next step. And No. Just, I felt like everybody wanted to understand what's going to happen next collectively for us on this. Like, it's not staff next step. It's just, do you all want to just put your hand up and say, Stella and Rachna work with superintendent to find time on our schedule for staff to come back with their analysis of the report and for us to discuss their recommendations of where we would go next with the investment of the consultant's work that we paid for. So I guess Ms. Keys-Gamarra, you have a question before we consider that option on the table?
Because I think that's not quite exactly what I was picking up from this room. We were talking about receiving a recommendation from staff. That would then feed into our next steps. So
I thought what I'm hearing, yes, we want a recommendation from staff, but they present it to the board so we can have questions about their recommendation, which would be coming back to a work session. You want to just have them recommend something that we read on a document?
No, I think when you say, I hate to have this conversation at 5 o'clock, but here we are. When you say this is to be brought back, it kind of skips the step of them being able to reflect, which is what he just asked for. So let him speak.
Maybe this is the win. We need to take what we heard. Let me work with the chair and vice chair to work to schedule an appropriate next time to bring before the whole board, not a committee, what our response to this is and our own thinking about next steps, both with the policy and any operationalizing once we've got the policy the board wants in place.
That's what I thought I said, so.
Yeah, I know, but it is.
I saw a lot of smiles, nodding heads.
I think you both were right. It's just late. You've been through 3 huge meetings today and a meeting yesterday.
All right, so based on what Dr. Braybrand said, can I see a show of hands from board members if you like that approach going forward from today's work session? All right, that's unanimous with everybody in the room. And again, I want to thank our consultants. I want to thank our staff who worked with them. And I also want to thank my colleagues for your incredible engagement on this after 2 marathon days. It was impressive, and I really appreciate it. Have a good night.